Welcome back to the Time for Heroes podcast, now in association with the Songbird HQ. Go to the songbirdhq.com for all your musical needs, latest news, reviews and interviews for some of the best signed and unsigned bands. The Songbird HQ also deliver PR services for new talent coming through. This week's guest on the podcast is Pete Jones, also known as Pete Welsh. Pete's wrote a book all about the Libertines called Kids In the Riot, High and Low With The Libertines. He was also in Naughty's band Kill City. We spoke about all this. We spoke about the Libertines story in great depth. As usual at the end, Pete picked his heroes. We discussed all this and much more. Hope you're all enjoying the podcast. I'll be back soon with another guest. Until then, head over to the songbirdhq.com and check out the website. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast, Peter Jones. Is it Peter Jones or Pete Jones?
Pete.
Pete Jones, also known as Pete Welsh,
right,
or Welsh Pete, or on Facebook Jack Jones, but we're calling him Pete Jones. So, Pete, you wrote the Libertines book, Kids In the Riot.
Sure.
You were also in Naughty's band Kill City, amongst lots of other things. So, what I like to do is just go back to the start, where you grew up, what life was like for a young Pete Jones.
Yeah, well, I'm from South Wales, from a little town called Port Talbot, which is famous for people like Richard Burton, Anthony Hopkins, and later Michael Sheen. So it's got an acting pedigree. It's a big steelworks town. I hated it as a kid, like you do, you know. And I left when I was 21, moved to London. Really wanted to get into bands. I'd been playing guitar for a short while by then, so came to London just with my guitar and a dream, if you like. That was in '94, right at the start of Britpop. So I sort of hit Camden, sort of sold all my old football, because I was a football fan, a bit of a football casual, you could say, and I had all the Stone Island stuff. I sold all that to fund my move to London, grew my hair, started wearing tight trousers, and found myself in Camden at the start of the Britpop thing, which was just a complete lifestyle change and a culture change, really. And I loved it. Got in a couple of little bands, mucking around Camden on the fringes of the Britpop scene. Got to know bands like Menswear, who you might remember were a sort of a Britpop band that had a lot of hype around them. People like Graham Coxon, all from just drinking in the Good Mixer pub in Camden.
Mm-hmm.
So that was where I was in my early 20s, looking to be a pop star. It never happened, but I sort of became very good friends. Well, the first person I met when I moved to London was a guy called Mick Whitnall, who I'm sure you're well aware of. He at the time was working in Carnaby Street, got me a job in a mod shop down there. We became fast friends. He had a ska band called 100 Men. He was like a skinhead kind of guy in those days and was very much into his ska, rocksteady, blue beat. And we just became great friends, inseparable really for the next 10 years. And a lot changed over that time. And during that course of time, from 94 to 2004, of course, the Libertines happened. Britpop came and went, if you like. And my first meeting with Pete Doherty would have been at the tail end of Britpop, which would have been 1997, when he would have been doing a bit of quick maths, I guess 18. And that brings us on to this, I suppose, the second act in my sort of London life, which was heavily influenced by the Libertines and led to the writing of the book.
Right. So when you met Pete, am I right in thinking, was he playing Chaz and Dave or something like that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so drinking in Camden, as I had been for 3 or 4 years, and getting to know lots of people, you'd often end up back at someone's flat. And I remember one night sitting around a dozen people perhaps drinking after, the pubs and clubs had shut. And he was sitting on the floor, cross-legged with a guitar, and he was playing Chas and Dave. And I remember thinking, it's an unusual thing to be playing, it's not something you'd expect a youngster to be really into. And he had real sort of nerve to sort of sit there and hold an audience, although not everyone was paying attention to him. And I thought, he's got charisma. He's an interesting young lad. I would have been 5 or 6 years older. And that was my first experience of him, as sort of a chirpy young buck, popular with people, cheeky, and he could play guitar and he could sing. And I just thought it was very strange that he was playing Chas and Dave. You might expect to play Oasis or Blur at that time. I'd see him around then for the next couple of years, during which time I was trying to get a band of my own together. And my advert in a guitar shop in Camden was answered by a young John Hassel, who would later become the Libertines bass player, obviously. So that was where it all started to cross-pollinate slightly. I don't think John knew Pete and Carl at that time. I certainly didn't know Carl. I'd met Pete and I would see him around. John joined my band. He was 15, 16. I was 23, 24. So it was a big age gap. Tom Bowen, I know you've spoken to as well, was the guitar player. So it was me and Tom, basically, and a succession of drummers, and John on bass. And John was a lovely kid, 15, 16, but, he won't mind me saying this, he was a bit immature at the time.
Right.
So, the age gap was a bit troubling. What he did have, and I know Pete and Carl said the same thing when they met him, was he had a house in the middle of Kentish town where he lived with his mum, with a basement where he could rehearse with all top of the range equipment. We thought this was manna from heaven at the time, because you didn't have to pay for a rehearsal room anymore.
Yeah.
His mum would come in and tell him to turn it down. He would tell him to go away, or words to that effect, which I found quite strange, because I would never have spoken to my mother like that. But he was a typical adolescent, and he was smoking dope, and he was just a troubled youth, if you like. But we got on really well with him. We loved him to bits, and it was great to make music with him for about 6-8 months. Then it got to the point where we just thought, he's a bit too young for us. And even though he comes with great guitars, great musicianship, he was a better musician than I was even then, age of 15, 16. It was time to let him go. And I come back to Mick Whitnor, who was, we were hanging out with all the time. And, he was our best mate. He was waiting in the wings to play bass, and he was a better option, really. So regrettably, we had to let John go, and everything that went with it, his equipment and his rehearsal space. So, it wasn't an easy decision to make, but John went, then Mick came in. It became a bit more professional. We got a little bit of a deal with, I can't remember who it was now, CBS or someone like that, to record a demo.
Right.
We got the old menswear drummer in, a guy called Tad. So it went up a level then. We recorded a demo, and it looked like we might get a deal. So it was really good. Meanwhile, John, who we'd sort of sacked, and I've since found out was really upset about it. He took it pretty hard. About a week after we'd let him go, he bumped into these two new lads in London who were, looking to form a band called Pete Doherty and Carl Barat. So, I knew Pete a little bit by this stage. I didn't know Carl. So you could say we did John a massive favour, because we sacked him from a band that wasn't really going anywhere. And he met up with two guys who would become an era-defining band with him on board. And so it all turned out well in the end for John.
Right. And, obviously at this time, the Libertines, they weren't known as the Libertines, they were known as the Strand. And, there's lots of lineup changes in this at that point. You had Scarborough Steve before John came in, the drummer, Mr. Razcox.
Yeah, well, I believe he died last year.
I
heard that recently. That's sad. I had met him a few times back then. Nice guy. Again, very, very unusual. Pete and Carl, you quickly realised that a real disregard for convention. They had a geriatric drummer. They didn't seem to care that didn't make the image of the band look too good. They had a revolving door of personnel. Scarborough Steve at that time maybe still is, an alcoholic. He was a shambling drunk. He made Pete and Carl look very professional, really. Nothing against Steve. I like Steve, but you know, they were known as ramshackle. They didn't have much regard for the conventions of being in a band. Whereas what we were trying, we wanted to be professional, if you like. And they flew in the face of that, and it was quite, you know, refreshing, I suppose, because they didn't really give a shit about whether they had a geriatric drummer or not, and whether they could get through a song or whether they had a set list. So they were really, really ramshackle and different, and, you know, far from fully formed at that stage. So, you know, those early days of the Libertines, I think I saw them in Filthy McNasty's, and nobody really took them seriously because they didn't take themselves seriously, or so at the time. I've since found out that they had, you know, burning ambition and drive. But at the time, they looked like they were just doing it for a laugh, you know.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, another character that was involved at some point was John's pal, Johnny Morel.
That's right, yeah.
What extent was his involvement? Because it's it depends what you read and where you read it as to how much involvement he had. Yeah,
well, I can shed some light on that. I suppose Johnny Morel, I met him round at John's house where we used to rehearse. Pre-John joining the Libertines. Johnny was just a mate of John's. They went to school together, would hang out with him. Again, they were smoking dope together, doing the hard stuff as well, even back then, which I thought, you know, 16, 17, that was pretty unusual, I thought, you know, but I guess it wasn't so much. But so Johnny Morel would have been part of that, what I just said, a revolving door of people coming through the Libertines. Clearly had his own ideas and went on to have more, I suppose, commercial success than the Libertines. Yeah. So yeah, he would have just been someone who was around, and, you know, the attitude back then was, you know, if you've got a guitar and you want to be part of this, you can join in if you like. There was no set that, and again, I come back to what was so different about them. They didn't seem to have conventional ideas about being in a band. You know, if you were there, get up on stage, join in. There was a guy called the Rabbi who was a freaky looking old guy who would get on stage and sing with them. And that wasn't my idea of a band. You know, my idea was there's the four of us. We're doing this properly. You know, we're going to look good. We're going to do this, and quite regimented. And they were completely different to that. And of course, they went on to huge success, becoming much more professional down the line. But it was they were very ramshackle is the word I keep using about them. You know, with anybody, you know, you could get up. I mean, Steve would fall off stage. John was the most professional of them, if I'm honest. You know, he was rock solid even then. And the drummer as well, the old guy, he would, you know, try and keep time because he had conventional ideas about what a band should be, like John did. But Pete and Carl would just pinball around the stage, and whoever wanted to get on stage with them would be part. It
doesn't, like, whenever I think of Johnny Morel, obviously I love Razor Light as well. Johnny's a big, massive character, and I just think there's no way it could work with Pete and Carl and Johnny, three big characters on that band. It would never have lasted.
Absolutely not, and it didn't last, and it makes you wonder how it even got off the ground in the first place. Because, like I say, Johnny had great ideas of his own. You can't argue with his back catalogue, what he's gone on to do. And yeah, there's three, I say egos. I mean, Johnny certainly got an ego. Pete and Carl, I've never really defined as being egocentric because they were so louche and just laid back, if you like. I mean, they certainly have got egos, but nothing like Johnny Morel's. And they were just in it for a laugh, really. They weren't focused, or they didn't seem to be focused. I mean, I've since gone on when I was writing the book, and, you know, they clearly wanted to get to where they were going, but they were so haphazard in the way they went about it. You wouldn't categorize it as a professional approach to becoming a pop star, or you know. But they you know, they had their sights on getting with Rough Trade because of the Smiths connection, and everything they set out to do, albeit in a very haphazard, unconventional way, they ended up doing.
Brilliant. And all this was going on within the Good Mixer then, or you get people coming in and out of there all the time. I've been in the Good Mixer once, and I never met anybody famous.
Yeah, well, this is slightly different. This would be sort of 98, 99. The Good Mixer heyday had passed then, and the Good Mixer was sort of 93, 94, 95.
Right.
The Britpop day, you know. So Pete and Carl and even John would have missed that because they were too young. By this time now, things had moved, if you like, or the Libertines scene or the Johnny Burrell kind of crowd had relocated, or not relocated because they were never there in the first place. But this is all happening in a pub called Filthy McNasty's.
Right.
Which is in Islington, which isn't Camden. So I was slightly off the beaten track, just around the back of Angel Station around there. And I think it all became, Shane McGowan was certainly associated with that pub because I think he had a stake in it. And, you know, you'd see Sinead O'Connor in there and people like that through the 90s. You know, it was very much an Irish thing. Pete, having Irish roots, I think he got a job there. I think it already had a musical kind of base to it, but he started bringing younger people in, his friends, and then just because he worked there, he had, you know, he could get up whatever nights he wanted to. I think he might have got Carl a job there as well. And suddenly this scene that was similar to the Good Mixer 3 or 4 years prior sprung up at Filthy McNasty's, and that's where it all kicked off. And they were wild nights there. I'm talking about 99, 2000, 2001, just before they got signed, where this storm was brewing, where people were starting to come down, A&R guys, and there was a real crowd. The Queens of Noise, Mairead and Tabitha, who were friends of Pete and Carl's, you know, they would coming up with their own ideas, so they'd be DJing. They were put on nights, and they were creating their own scene, and you've got to give them credit for that. They created it from scratch. And it was a kind of there was poetry in there as well. It was really esoteric, arty kind of thing, and that's credit to Pete, really. You know, he was into all those things, and they created their own little buzz and their own little vibe. And suddenly, people started drifting over from Camden to Filthy McNasty's, and it helped that I was working in a shop round the corner from there at the time, and Mick Whitmore was as well. So we would drink there anyway because it was our local. So we got caught up in that thing, and you know, we obviously knew John from previous, and we could see that they was getting going with them. You know, that this after 3 years of being regarded as a little bit of a joke, really, because they didn't take themselves too seriously. They had Gary on drums by now, and because he'd come from playing with Eddie Grant and you know, he was a very professionally minded guy.
Yeah, a very good pedigree, don't he?
Absolutely. I mean, he was brilliant, and he just lifted them up again. And then you had John's bass playing locked in with Gary. They suddenly had a rhythm section that was as good as anybody. That allowed Pete and Carl, who had a much less professional approach, to just float over the top with those two guys and pinball off each other on stage and drop the ball, if you like, but in a charming way that captivated audiences. And suddenly they were a serious proposition. And, you know, we're talking about, this would have been late 2001. I think that's when they signed the Rough Trade deal. Yeah.
So obviously Barney would be managing them then. Obviously she would have helped as well. Was it Barney then that brought Gary Powell in?
I think it was, yeah. I didn't really know. I mean, I got to know her a little later on. She, you know, was swept away by, I think she was a lawyer. She wasn't even in music, but she was a lawyer, and she was very, very smart, very savvy. And she was just captivated by these guys. I think she had a soft spot for Scarborough Steve in the first place. He was a good looking guy in those days. I wonder what he looks like these days. Pretty ravaged, I'd imagine. But yeah, so she brought some professionalism and some nous to the band. And she brokered a deal with Rough Trade, and everything just sort of swept up. And the next thing I knew, they were running around town with loads of money in their pockets, which they never had before. They were always on the ponce. And suddenly they were signed to Rough Trade, and you couldn't really believe that it had happened. And it all sort of tightened up from there. They became, you know, the geriatric drummer had gone. The sort of they smartened up their act, basically. The Libertines, as the public would come to know them outside of this little London-centric scene, was born.
Yeah. So at this point then, what was going on with your band? Obviously, we never mentioned the name, the Samaritans.
That's right. Yeah.
But what was going on with yourselves? Were you still plodding along?
That had come and gone, really. And then that had come and gone by 2000. So me, Mick, Tom and Tug from Menswear, we went our separate ways, all still pals still. And around about the time of the Libertines getting the Rough Trade deal, that was when me and Tom met this lady called Lisa Moorish. who's a great friend to this day. She was putting a band together, and we met her in the Dublin Castle in Camden. And she said, we knew who she was because she did a dance, like she did a profile as a dance artist years previous. Yeah. And she was kind of well known for one thing or another. And she bumped into me and Tom. I had long hair in those days. He had long hair. We looked like a band straight away. She went, fuck, I've got a bass player and a guitar player in one fell swoop. I'm ready to go. And she had a deal with Alan McGee, that's right. And I knew Alan a little bit anyway from going to his club nights in the Notting Hill Arts Club. So it was just it all fell into place nicely. We thought, well, if Alan McGee's behind this, we'll have a bit of that. I mean, who wouldn't, you know? Lisa was great as well. We got on with her straight away. And Kill City was formed from there. And, you know, we knew the Libertines. And so we went hand in hand with them a little bit from there, from that onwards. We shot a video in the Albion rooms. Lisa was getting to know Pete, you know, obviously they've got a kid together now. And we just became part of that scene. So, you know, there was a scene springing up around the Libertines now. Bands, copycat bands. Kill City were never a copycat band because we had an electro kind of thing going on. Yeah. But we had the same punky spirit. We were a little bit older than them. So, you know, we felt a little bit like, should we really be part of this crowd? But lots of bands springing up, you know, out of Filthy McNasty's. And we went hand in hand with the Libertines for those first couple of years, and it was great to be part of that world.
So going back to the Libertines, obviously the signing with Rough Trade, which is a major deal. Really, Rough Trade's one of the best record labels around. James Endicott was it signed him with it. That's
right, and he had just signed the Strokes, so. Again, outside of London, outside of the UK, a wider thing was happening with garagey sounding bands were coming into vogue. You know, you had the White Stripes kind of kicked it off, I suppose. Then the Strokes arrived, and you know there was suddenly skinny legged guitarists with a thing, you know, and looking like Blondie, with a New York kind of vibe like the Strokes had, and that was massive. You know, the Strokes became a kind of cultural phenomenon. And Rough Trade had signed them. And then the Libertines sprung up maybe a year after, or came to their attention. And suddenly James realised there's a London version of the Strokes here. That's being a little unkind to the Libertines because they had their own thing going on. But on the surface, that's what they were doing. They were doing the same kind of angular, scratchy guitar sounds, new wave sounding kind of thing. And there was a great synergy between the New York scene and what was coming up in London. And then for Rough Trade to get the Strokes and the Libertines on, you know, both sides, that was massive.
The Strokes comes up a lot on the podcast because obviously before that, like when the Strokes kind of broke into the British music, I mean there wasn't much going on at that point. No. You had like Limp Bizkit and stuff like that, and the British stuff was all kind of acoustic-y type, kind of safe. Yeah.
I suppose you had
and stuff like that.
Star Sailor and people like that. And it was all a bit sort of, you know, and then you had, you know, your Oasis sort of wannabes like Embrace and stuff. And Oasis by this stage as well. And of course, everybody loves Oasis, but they started to sound really podgy and pedestrian.
Yeah.
And you know, and they were like a stadium band long before that. And you couldn't really get to them. And the Libertines came along. And that's why I always think there was a sort of a parallel between them and Oasis. They suddenly blew them away in a sense. Obviously, history will be kinder to Oasis than the Libertines because they achieved more. But at that time, they made them look like stodgy, you know, prog rockers almost, you know, because they came along with this punk spirit. That's what was so exciting about the Libertines, and of course the Strokes as well. And suddenly bands like Oasis looked like they were, you know, it was dad rock was the term that was bandied around.
It felt like a change, didn't it? It felt like something big was happening.
Yeah, you know, and the White Stripes kicked it off, you know, in a big ways. The Strokes, the Libertines. I think they were a band called the Vines. They were big for a short while.
Yeah.
Kind of a more grungy they would have been, I suppose. But there was definitely a return to scratchy guitar rock and skinny jeans, and it was, you know, right up my alley because I was into all that, you know, punk and the CBGB's kind of bands. And this is what was happening suddenly at the turn of the century, 2001, 2002. And the Libertines were at the epicenter of it.
Obviously, one of the most famous pictures of the Libertines is the one of the four of them with the red guards jackets. So, I mean, I think after that, it seemed like every other band was wearing these military jackets. I can mind the Strokes. I mind Julian Casablancas wearing one.
Yeah.
And I can mind Hope of the States. They were the same.
Right,
They used to wear them as well. So, I mean, that's a big change in look, because at the start, they were more... They used to wear suits and stuff like that, didn't they?
That's right, yeah. They're just those charity shop chic, if you like. Funny enough, I mentioned menswear earlier on. He wore a guard's tunic on top of the Pops when they went on there, 5-6 years earlier. So you've got to give him credit, really. He was the first guy I ever saw. I mean, it was a Beatlesy kind of look, really, wasn't it? Because the Beatles had the similar kind of tunics. They weren't guard jackets, but it was a regimented Beatles kind of look. I don't recall Pete and Carl wearing those coats. I know John and Gary didn't like being seen in them in public because it was a pretty loud jacket to wear. And I don't recall Pete and Carl wearing them to the pub very often. I mean, they wore them for those photos with Roger Sargent, and they wore them on stage a few times, but they wouldn't walk down the street in them too often.
Which is funny because it's so iconic, seeing those pictures.
Yeah,
and they
maybe
look so good in them.
Yeah, maybe I'm remembering it wrong, but I don't remember seeing him in it very often. I know one time Pete left his one at my house, and I had it for about 3 months, and he finally took it back off me. And I wish I'd held on to it now, because it'd be worth a few quid. But no, I was always going to give it back to him. But yeah, they managed to marry image and sound in a way that was really brilliant at that time. And I got swept up in. I was older than them, and they were my favourite band. I don't mind saying that. They were really exciting. They had an energy that you wanted to be around. They were as close to the Clash, I suppose, that I was going to see. I was too young for that. My favourite band. I was too young to be around in those days. And so there was just this punk energy, which I was really, chuffed to be part of and be swept along with them, because we did a couple of tours with them. And we played lots of times around London with them in various little dives, and guerrilla gigs and all that sort of stuff. That was really exciting to be part of, because that was totally fresh. And that was completely Pete and Carl's doing, was this guerrilla gig thing. It was the early days of the internet. You could suddenly just say, there's going to be a shindig tonight, £10 on the door. You'd suddenly have 200 kids turning up.
Yeah.
I think Pete quickly realised, it wasn't a philanthropic gesture. It was quickly a money-making venture as well. But it was a fantastic thing to be part of. I mean, it wasn't great for their neighbours, but it was really exciting. And so many. Really, I remember there was an article in the NME, and it was kind of like Pete was stood there, and you had about 40 members of different bands. It was quite an iconic picture, and they were all looking at him. And within a year, this is of them having the record deal. All these copycat bands or bands inspired by them had sprung up. A lot of them not very good, but it really happened really quickly. By the summer of 2003, they were really hot, and they'd inspired all these bands. The NME couldn't resist putting them on the cover. I mean, I think they went on to be the band that featured on the cover most of any band ever, which tells you how exciting it was, and how they revitalized the music press at the time. Yeah, because it gave them these pretty boys to put on the cover. It was inspiring massive really fanatical fan base. So it really was a cultural. I don't think it's had the credit in hindsight that it deserves.
During recordings, they were initially Bernard Butler was brought in to produce. Were you were a bit during the Britpop days or the tail end of Britpop? So were you aware of Bernard Butler?
Yeah. I mean, I liked Suede up to a point. I mean, I wasn't mad about them, but that wasn't. I think that was a rough trade idea to bring Bernard in. Obviously, he's a big name, super talented. I don't think he got on very well with them.
Yeah.
And I don't think they were happy with the recording they did with him. And then, of course, Jeanette Lee, who'd been in Public Image Limited and was Jeff's partner in Rough Trade, Jeff Travis's partner, she knew Mick Jones obviously really well, and decided to bring him in. And that was just inspired because you suddenly had this band that looked and sounded a little bit like The Clash, produced by one of The Clash, which was just a marriage made in heaven, even though he was incredibly hands-off in his approach. An example of Pete's generosity, he knew I was a massive Clash fan. He just dropped it into the conversation one day. He said, "Oh, Mick Jones is producing us." I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, come down and just hang at the studio tomorrow." I was like, "Oh, I couldn't wait." The next day I was there before Pete arrived. And, I had a drink in the pub next door with John. And then we went to the studio in St. John's Wood next door. And there was Mick Jones. And I spent the next few days just hanging out there. I don't think Pete was there half the time. I mean, this was where it was all starting to unravel, even before it got going, if you like.
Uh-huh.
Just to be in the studio with Mick Jones, drinking. He always had a can of Stella in his hand and spliff in the other hand. Just to be around him, hearing these old Clash stories, it's just fantastic. And I'll always be grateful to Pete for that.
Oi, oi, you wonderful people out there. You're listening to the Time for Heroes podcast in association with the Songbird HQ. Bosh, get all over it.
One thing you mentioned there, obviously, about even at that point, it was starting to unravel to a certain extent. Obviously, and in the book, I think early on, Pete was quoted a couple of things he said about the rot setting in the beginning and the end. Even at that point, I think that was before we had the record deal with Rough Trade. So do you think Pete kind of had a foreshadowing of what was going to go on? Do you think Pete was insecure in the relationship?
Well, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't have noticed that at the time, to be honest. But you read about it now, and it was they clearly had a multifaceted relationship that was much deeper and crazier and fraught than anybody realized at the time. I mean, they used to fall out and fight each other and stuff, but that wasn't unusual for 22, 23-year-old guys.
Yeah.
I mean, it was unraveling really from the minute they met each other. And I learned that in the writing of the book, getting much more deeply into it. And it was just a fraught relationship. And I think I read something reasonably recently where Carl said it wasn't just the drugs at that time, it was mental illness. And I think that's definitely, that really changed me when I read that, because they're both pretty mad characters. And all that testosterone and you chuck a load of heavy drugs on top of it as well. That's why it was so explosive, and that's why it unraveled very, very quickly. I mean, we're talking about 2002, they're in the studio with Mick Jones. By 2003, Pete's gone to jail. He's formed a breakaway band. It's all kind of, it had all collapsed around them, really. It went on to carry on, in various forms. But I could never understand why Pete didn't want to put more into keeping it together, because they worked so hard to get to a place where they were on the cover of magazines and they had a record deal. And he seemed to want to sabotage it, the way he was behaving. And I remember thinking, God, I'd love to be in this position where you suddenly got success, because my bands were just limped on, never really got there. And he seemed to sort of want to tear it all down as soon as he got it. And I think you've got to remember Carl, slightly less crazy than Pete, but crazy in his own way. And we come back to what he said, they were both suffering mental illness at that time. And it's good to see them both in a good place now. But you add all those ingredients in: youth, ego, drugs, and that's a lethal concoction. And the crowd that was around them as well, it was it became very, very dark very quickly.
Yeah, it became a bit of a circus at that point as well. Yeah, so obviously, I mean, like what we were talking about with Pete and Carol and their relationship, because obviously, like me and my friend, I always felt the same. Like we used to go and see Libertines all the time, and I always kind of thought about our relationship as Pete and Carl, and my friend was more like Carl and I was more like Pete. Like I always felt like I was relying on him to look after me and make sure I was all right. And that was always the impression I got. Pete and Carol's relationship was that Carol was always having to look out for Pete and kind of fight this to a certain extent.
That's a fair assumption, but I mean, he was only marginally more sensible than Pete in those days. Right. I mean, when I say sensible, I mean they were taking a shitload of drugs, and there's no getting away from it, and it got very dark. When you're talking about heroin and crack, not that Carl was doing much of that. It was, they're very dark circles that you move in. There's dodgy people around. It's not healthy. It's not like just a heavy coke scene. This is a dark, scuzzy world that can't be sustained really for any length of time. And of course, people started dying around that scene. I can think of a dozen people over the years who I used to see around who've succumbed to because you just can't muck around. You look back at the CBGB's scene, with the Heartbreakers and Johnny Thunders. They're all dead now. Because you with those drugs. It's not like Fleetwood Mac with just doing loads of beat. These are dangerous drugs. So it was it quickly became a really scuzzy world to be part of, and that was a shame. That was because it took a lot of the innocence and a lot of the energy out of it. And it's certainly, I mean, after the initial rush of success with the Libertines, when you start talking about Pete going to jail, it all became very, very focused around drugs for him.
Yeah.
And Carl was keeping his end up there as well because he was full throttle. But they were all nutty, and John and Gary were the calming influences, but they didn't really have much input into because Pete and Carl were the faces of the band, and they had a different deal with Rough Trade to the other guys. They had their own deal. I think they got 40% each, and John and Gary got 10% each. So it was a toxic mix anyway, because that's not how many bands operate.
Yeah.
So there were tensions always, I think, in underlying in the band. And I know that James Endicott and Jeff Travis were despairing of what was going on because, it burned so brightly initially, and then Pete was suddenly out of the band. He was in jail. They limped on, doing a few dates with just Carl, and of course that's not the same at all. No disrespect to Carl, but the deal is Pete and Carl, they had such an incredible chemistry and something completely different that people hadn't seen before. So you take one of them out of the equation, it just isn't the same.
Yeah.
And of course, we're talking, this would have been 2003. For the next few years, it was just complete chaos. And the recording of the second album, I wasn't around for that, to be honest with you. Not in the studio anyway, but we did a tour with them.
Well, going back a bit, obviously, you toured with Kill City, toured with them up the Bracket tour, which also involved Left Hand as well.
Yeah.
Alan Wass. Is this a tour where Hooligans and Ye came about as well?
Correct, yeah, that would have been. That was where Pete and I sort of co-wrote that, knocked it about in a Cardiff hotel room. So yeah, it was still fairly innocent then. That would have been September 2002. There were no heavy drugs on that tour, as I recall, because you simply couldn't access them in Plymouth and Bournemouth and places like that. Peter didn't have the street smarts at that time to go off and score drugs. There'd be bits and bobs floating around, but it was generally just booze-fueled hijinks. Still on a tight budget in those days. I mean, they had a tour bus. We were in the back of a splitter van. Left Hand were in a carpet van. Just sort of falling out the back of that. It was all useful hijinks really on that tour. And of course, the album hadn't come out. The album came out during that tour. That's right. So it was still small venues, albeit packed to the rafters, full of enthusiastic fans. Because they'd done a little mini tour before that, before they had any press. And they'd already built up a little fan base. People were turning up in their own sort of homemade Libertines t-shirts and scoring on their jeans and all that sort of stuff. And so they'd already whet the appetite around the provincial towns of the UK, ready for that Up the Bracket tour, when suddenly the press came on board. And, they became a very cult, hot prospect, and the enemy would seem to be there at every turn to report on it, and gave them a real leg up because they could see there was something exciting happening here. There was this really good-looking, exciting, chaotic, crazy band with great tunes as well. The whole package.
Yeah.
So they came on board early doors and sort of covered every step of it.
I think a lot of that's forgotten. That obviously a lot of people kind of say about the tabloids, and some of the people at NME gave them bad press. But I mean, I spoke to Anthony Thornton for the podcast, and obviously he ended up writing a book about them, the same as yourself. Right. And he was massively supportive of the Libertines, and obviously you had Roger Sargent doing a lot of the photography. So they did have the backing there.
Big time, yeah. I mean, and Anthony, as I recall, he was, like myself, we just loved this band. We weren't ashamed to say it. Anthony was a bit older than them, like myself, but it was exactly what you were looking for. You were looking for a new wavy sounding band, punky sounding band that looked great, had great songs, great attitude. It was everything you wanted, really. They would have been my favourite band if I'd been 15, 16, or as I was at the time, pushing 30. And Roger Sargent, he's older than me. He loved them, so they definitely had something that inspired and excited not just the youngsters, but people my age. And the music press just went crazy for them. I mean, the NME, I think people got a bit sick of them putting them on the cover all the time, but because they were so photogenic and they were so charismatic, it was too good to miss. I mean, they were streets ahead of other bands in terms of energy and charisma. They were exciting to be around, for sure.
So obviously, touching back again on Hooligans and E, who gets the credit for that then?
Well, I think it's meant to say Doherty Jones, which would, I'd love to see that, and I'm not sure if when Kill City put it out, it said that. He was not. I came back from a football match where a few of my pals had been taking E at half time, and he started knocking it into shape on a guitar, and I threw a few lines in. He came up with the tune. It's mostly his song, but it was inspired by my recollections of the day. And I chucked in a few lines, the Aquascutum line, the Burberry line, meat pies. So it's a co-write, really. The irony was, at the time, Alan McGee had come on board as manager of the Libertines at that stage. He loved it. He wanted to release it as a single. And I would have loved that, because that would have been a massive payday. And that never happened. And I had to watch Wolfman get a co-credit on something, make a lot of money from it. I had to watch Mark Hamilton, sadly no longer with us now, Mark Keds, who'd been in Senseless Things. He got a co-write on Can't Stand Me Now, made a lot of money from it. So these two guys who were part of the same circle as myself managed to get co-writes on Libertines singles, and did well out of it. The one which I co-wrote and McGee wanted to come out, I think it was deemed as too sort of, it would have been censored for radio, because it was mentioning drugs. So it never saw the light of day, but I believe it's, popular amongst Baby Shambles fans, Libertines fans, and it went down well at Kill City gigs as well. So it's a good song. It's a good song, whichever way you hear it. The Kill City version is good, with Lisa on the vocals. Yeah.
Well, that's the one that I heard first. I heard Kill City version, and I loved it. And then I can mind going down to my pals, and he was playing it was like a ramshackle kind of Baby Shambles version he had, but I always preferred the Kill City one. I liked the production on the Kill City one. Yeah,
that was good fun making that. That was we were let loose in a really good studio. Alan McGee put us in, and we really enjoyed making that. We did a good video for it as well. But yeah, if Libertines or Baby Shambles had recorded a high-end version of it, it could have been a hit, as opposed to a sort of a bit of a cult hit as it is now amongst their fans. But it wasn't meant to be, but good fun, and I haven't heard it myself for many a year, so I might have to dig it out, give it a spin. I've got it on 7-inch here somewhere, I think. Yeah.
Obviously, you mentioned Wolfman. And it kind of gets me onto the kind of the people that were round about then. There was like probably the bad influences on Pete at that point. But obviously that being, if you touch back right to Scarborough Steve, you've got characters like this right through the Libertines story. But people like Wolfman and Scarborough Steve, other people that are obviously hangers on, Dominic Masters for the others, people like this. Yeah. To what extent do you think that was influencing Pete at that point? And how would you say that Carol was dealing with that? Did it feel as if he was pulled away?
Yeah, that was massively. I mean, Carl was friendly with all those guys as well, but they were very much. Pete was the centre of that scene, and that's where a chasm started to form between Pete and Carl. They started hanging out with different people. Pete's crowd was extremely druggy, and Carl had by this stage adopted a much more professional approach to the band because he could see it was going places, and he fell upon his shoulders to try and hold it together, I suppose. And the worse Pete got, the more despairing Carl got. Because he wanted to take it to the next level and bring everything up a level in professional terms. Pete just sort of slipped away. Really, he started to slip away basically, and next thing you know, there's jail terms and what have you. Definitely. I mean, he was no angel, obviously, but it wasn't good to be surrounded by a heavy druggy crowd. And then when he came out of jail, he suddenly started being hanging around with people he'd met in prison, like small time villains and who should never have been in a music crowd of people, heavy people, just scuzzy people who he'd met in prison. And he's thinking, hold on a minute, one minute you're an indie kid who's hanging out with like minds. Now you've got these horrible people hanging around. It all got really, really dark, and that's what happens with those drugs and then prison and what have you. It all
must
changed.
Have been so hard to watch and not really be able to change the course there.
Yeah, well, and then of course I think Rehab came in there. He went to Farm Place, so it all within the space of a year. If you think when they had the first NME cover, that would have been sort of July, August 2002. By the same time, the following year, he's been in jail. He's been in rehab. It all happened so quick. You would have thought that first year would have been just unbridled success and an upward trajectory, and what it was just complete chaos and the first sort of dissolution of the band falling apart. So it's it self-sabotage, you could call it, succumbing to crazy drug-addled sort of influences. But it all kind of fell apart. And Carl, I know, was really devastated because he had, like I say, was on a straighter path by this stage. I could see that if they seized the metal, grabbed the bull by the horns, they could have gone on to be huge much quicker than they did. And it was all falling apart, and it was horrible for him to see. And it was horrible for me to see, because I thought they'd just go from strength to strength, and Pete seemed bent on ruining everything, really.
Yeah, because I mean, at the point where he was out the band and it was coming up festival season, I think it was Reading and Tea in the Park. Because I seen them at Tea in the Park with Anthony Rosamondo filling in for him. But there was always that kind of hope that Pete would turn up and he would play and he would be back in the band. But it must have been, at that point, it must have been so far apart that they couldn't have him there.
That's right. I mean, they should have been doing those festival dates, which is what every band builds up to. They should have been doing that, with aplomb, and instead they were limping on. I love Anthony; he's great, but he wasn't Pete. And the whole deal with the Libertines is it's Pete and Carl, basically. So you take one of them out of the equation, and then of course he's trying to get this other band going. And I remember thinking, you've got a perfectly good band there. Why don't you just stay the course with them? You've worked so hard to get to where you are, and now you want to go back to the start again with a new band. And of course, Baby Shammers go on to have their own merits. I like a lot of their music, but why you would want to start again from scratch when you've got when you're sailing on course nicely with the Libertines, it made no sense to me. And it was obviously informed by crazy drug influences at the time. And I suppose Pete and Carl's relationship, it just was too volatile to stay on course at that time, and of course it's went on for many years. It only seems to be in the last 5 years they seem to be on a steady course. But, yeah.
So at that point with Baby Shambles, because Baby Shambles, they made a good couple of records. Again, there was quite a few lineup changes within that. But what was Carol's perspective of Baby Shambles? And because Carol would have knew these guys and Baby Shambles. So what was the feeling like between the two bands then? At
that point, when Peter came out of prison and was getting Baby Shambles together, he had the shaved head, he looked different, everything had just sort of changed. He'd lost a lot of weight. They didn't. I don't think he had much contact with Carl because he burgled him, and there was a lot of resentment. Carl was off trying to just drag the corpse of the Libertines around and keep it alive. Pete was starting off. So I don't think towards the end of 2003 they saw much of each other, and then they came back together. I'm getting my timeline wrong here because he came out of prison and they got back together, didn't they? That's right.
Yeah,
and in Chatham, yeah, and then it looked like there was going to be a new lease of life, and of course that's when they went down Charlie McGee's house in Wales, which is about a mile from where I am now, and all that craziness unfolded. So
Carl split his face open.
Yeah, so any hope that coming out of prison and getting back together was going to be some sort of reconciliatory fresh start, went out the window straight away. The craziness began. I'm getting my timeline wrong there slightly. Yeah, it was prior to going to prison that they didn't see much of each other. When he came out, the Libertines started again in earnest, and of course, they did some good gigs that Christmas at the Forum. We supported them. That's right. They were on the cover of the NME Christmas edition, as I recall.
That's right. Yeah.
It looked like everything was back on course to the untrained eye would have done at the time, because McGee was manager. They were getting the second album together, but behind the scenes, it was as crazy and as volatile as ever. And of course,
during the recordings of that album, they had security guards and things to keep them apart, didn't they?
That's right. These two big brothers from Leeds, these two man mountains that McGee knew of. They'd done some security for him in the past, so they had to be pulled apart in the recording. So going to prison, coming out, it had had no effect on Pete in terms of calming him down at all. Again, he was still young at this stage, 24, 25, and a lot of resentment, a lot of craziness that went into that second album. The second album is great, but it is much darker than the first album. You hear that there's a lot of tension going on, but it's still made for a fantastic album. And I think it was around the time of 2004 when that had come out. Pretty much as soon as it came out, it all fell apart again. And of course, Baby Shambles had come on a little bit because the people were still doing that, and then they kind of almost had a better sort of shelf life than the Libertines for a year or two after that, and left Carl sort of floundering, trying to put Dirty Pretty Things together.
Dirty Pretty Things as well was they were a decent outfit, but it just felt as if Carl's heart wasn't in it the same. It didn't seem as if he took it seriously.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, he was lucky to get straight back into a band that could trouble the charts and could have a profile and do festivals. But yeah, you're right, his heart wasn't in it because it was always about him and Pete, for all the craziness that went with it. He believed in that. He believed in their partnership, and suddenly it's gone. Nobody knew it was going to come back together with, over the years, and be in a happy place that it is now in 2023. At the time, it looked like it was lost forever, and it was the dark time. And I saw quite a bit of him around that time, and he was a very troubled soul, even though he was having moderate success with Dirty Pretty Things. Baby Shambles sort of stole a march on them, in my opinion. They seem to be doing more worthwhile stuff. Their records were better. And his profile by this stage had gone through the roof with the tabloid thing. You know, it was a different proposition altogether.
Yeah, I mean, you had the Kate Moss. Kate Moss was there or thereabouts as well at that point as well, which kind of catapulted them. That's
right. It became a completely different proposition, and it was the Libertines' name almost got forgotten, and it was all about Pete Doherty. So, you know, he became someone that everybody in the country knew about, which is so far removed from 2 or 3 years prior when they were just a cult indie band. It all changed. You know, when you had the internet taking off as well at that time, so it's all exploded in a negative way, really.
Obviously, I mean, what's forgotten and all that is like people like yourself, and obviously Carol have mentioned how hurtful it is for you to see them. Obviously, Lisa was pregnant with Pete's child, so is that how kind of Kill City, was that the demise of Kill City when a Steele came on the scene? And
well, not so much that. I mean, we had a couple of years after that. I think I left because my book had come out, and I'd sort of got more interested in writing and stuff. And I was always a bit older than the Libertines. I still am, 6 or 7 years old. I felt, you know, by this stage I was in my early 30s. I wasn't really comfortable jumping around on stage with an audience of like 19, 20-year-olds. So I was starting to drift out of playing anyway. So yeah, Kill City limped on, I think, a little bit after that. Then Lisa got into other things. And of course, yeah, she had the kid by then. And, you know, we kind of lost touch. I'd see Pete sporadically, and I see more of Carl, really. But I mean, since 2006, 2007, I've not really seen much of Pete, to be honest with you.
Right.
I'm still in touch with John. I mean, if I saw Pete tomorrow or Carl, we'd pick up where we left off, I'm sure. And I've still got enormous fondness for those guys. I hope they have for me. I'm pretty sure they have. We went off in different directions. Once all that tabloid.
You've never seen them live or anything since then, no?
I did see them in. Of course. Yeah, I'm jumping ahead too far. When they got back together in 2010, I saw them at the Forum. Funny enough, when Roger Sargent made that film, there's only 2 people in it who speak, and that's me and James Endicott, other than the band. So I pop up in that film. So yeah, so I saw them around that time.
I'm going to need to rewatch that back, actually. I've not watched that for years.
Yeah, that's good. But again, when they got back in 2010, that was all quite kind of fraught even then, you know. And then I saw them again. The last time I saw them would have been in Hyde Park in 2014.
Yeah, I've seen them at Hyde Park, and then I've seen them a couple of times since here in Glasgow.
I saw them in Ali Pali as well in late 2014. And then my life changed. I met someone, I got married, I moved out to London, and now I'm back in Wales. So, you know, I'm just not in that world anymore. But
it does seem, the live stuff does seem more polished and kind of, they know what they're doing from song to song. It's all a bit more professional, which it's funny seeing it because I don't know, I prefer the ramshackleness, the punkiness.
Well, that's what their USP was, really, wasn't it? It was the ramshackle charm of not knowing what's going to happen. So I agree with you. When I've seen them on the TV, it all looks, I wouldn't call it polished by any stretch, but it's more polished than it was. And that takes away a little bit of the charm. But I suppose, you know, you're looking at guys now in their early 40s, mid 40s even. They're too old to be drawing on their jeans and falling off the stage. So it's certainly more polished. And I've got to say, I wasn't impressed with the last album. It's all about those first 2 records for me. I don't blame them for going on, and people still want to see them. But for me, it belonged to a certain time.
Well, this is the thing as well. I mean, like when I seen them last year in Glasgow, and you look at the crowd, and you've got like people their age, and then you get youngsters in their early 20s that can't remember the initial success. They're there for the last album. So
yeah, when I saw them at Hyde Park, I've got to be honest, I was disappointed the kind of crowd that they were attracting. because it was massive. It was a massive gig, but the crowd was very much like you get at an Oasis gig. I'd seen it the year before at the Stone Roses gigs in Finsbury Park. Very laddie, and nothing wrong with that. You know, I used to be a football lad myself, but you know, very boozy, very cokey. And you know, it was a long way from the original Libertines crowds. You know, they seemed to attract this football terrace kind of crowd, and I was a bit dismayed by that, and it got a bit rough as well.
Yeah, I mean, I see that a lot of gigs nowadays. The crowd doesn't seem to match the band.
Yeah,
like as kind of a lot of these bands now attract a laddie crowd, but if you listen to the band, they're not like that. Even like there's a band up here, the Snuts, and it's the same sort of crowd they would attract. But you speak to the boys and the things they do, they're supporting food banks, supporting women's rights at gigs and things like that, which is so far away from the crowd that they attract. It's mental. Yeah, no,
I don't suppose you've got any control over that. If you what sort of crowd, certainly the tabloid thing and the craziness attracted a certain kind of person to Pete, and they've retained that crowd. And I mean, I suppose if you're going to sell out Hyde Park, you're going to get people of all shapes and sizes. But I was a bit surprised to see that they basically borrowed Oasis's crowd, you know, which you expect at Oasis with Liam and his persona. They've always had that crowd. I was surprised to see that the Libertines had kind of co-opted it, really, whether they wanted to or not.
Yeah. So, what's going on with yourself now? Then you said that you kind of concentrated on writing books. So what other books have you wrote?
Well, when I left London, I wrote a book about an old footballer from Swansea. That was a tiny concern compared to the Libertines book. Then I ended up making a film about a guy called John Toshack. So so I've done two things really, as well as doing other bits about it. The two projects I've done, which have been my sort of big things, was the Libertines book and the Toshack film, and they're both like the ultimate passion projects because the two things I'm interested in really are football and music. The Libertines thing, the book was a dream because it was so colourful to write about. So I was very lucky to be in the right place at the right time for that. And then football, my other love, and John Toshack in Swansea City is my big passion. So I've managed to make two pieces of art, if you like, which are my ultimate passions. So I've been really lucky in that sense. And if I don't do anything else creatively, I'll be happy with those two things I've done. So I wouldn't call myself a writer or a filmmaker, but I've done both those things. And anything, I'm racking my brain for other things which I'm interested in because I'm only interested in doing stuff that I'm passionate about.
Yeah.
And I was passionate
when you
about
get music and football, you don't need anything else anyway.
Well, yeah, that's been my life since I was 5 or 6. So I don't really, I like film and I like, I like keeping fit these days, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, football and music are all I'm interested in.
Yeah. So whereabouts can you get this John Toshack film?
Yeah, well, that's on Amazon Prime, that is. So
I'll have a look for that.
Yeah. So you can, if you've got Amazon Prime, you can watch it for free. It came out last year. That took me 6 years to make. Having all sorts of doors closed in my face. Getting to know Tosh himself, who'd been my hero since I was 5 years old. He's a tricky customer as well, a bit like Pete Doherty, not easy to work with. But we got there in the end, and it was a wonderful thing to realise my dream to make that film, just like it was to write the Libertines book. So I've been very lucky that of the two things I'm passionate about, I've managed to pull off. And I'm just looking around now for another project to get my teeth into, and it'll be something to do with football or music. So watch this space for that.
There's another boy, Johnny Owen. I think he's Welsh, is he?
Yeah, he's a good pal of mine, Johnny. Yeah.
Well, he's made some good documentaries, football ones. Obviously,
yes, right.
my favourite one's the Three Kings about the Steen, Shankly, and Busby.
That's right. Well, I've not seen that one yet, but the Forest film that he made about Brian Clough was a big influence on me making the Toshack film.
Brilliant soundtrack as well on that.
Yeah, he was very fortunate there that they had a budget for that. We didn't have a budget for a chart soundtrack, unfortunately, but we made our own music for it, which is really, really good. I've got to watch The Three Kings because obviously I'm interested in Shankly because he and Toshack, he was Toshack's mentor at Liverpool. So yeah, I really want to see that. And Johnny's a great mate and he's doing really well. And it's great to see because I've known him since I was about 16. Although he supports Cardiff, so we don't get on. We don't get on all the time. But I've had bragging rights over him these last couple of seasons. And let's hope that continues.
Brilliant. So we're at the end, really, other than picking your heroes.
Yeah.
So
we're giving this some thought, yeah.
It depends whether we can fit that into 8 minutes or whether.
I think we probably can because it's you know, it's not very imaginative. My heroes. You said 4 dinner guests. I would have John Lennon and Paul McCartney, just because you could say John Lennon on his own or Paul McCartney on his own. I think I'd like have them both together to see them bouncing off each other. And I would have the other two, again, not particularly imaginative, I'd have Joe Strummer and Mick Jones.
Right.
So you've got 2 guys who are no longer with us, 2 who are still with us, but to see Joe and Mick bouncing off each other, John and Paul bouncing off each other, would be great. And then just to sit and watch that and ask him questions. I met Joe a couple of times and I've known Mick a little bit through Pete, obviously. Never met McCartney, never met Lennon, obviously. They'd be my perfect dinner guests. I'd like to say someone more sort of, what's the word, obscure and artistic, but I'm not going to do that. And I think, what would I cook for them? Well, I've been making a lot of soups recently. I do a really mean butternut squash soup, so you probably won't hear that in the same breath. So I had the Beatles, the Clash, and butternut squash soup. But I've got one of those hand whisks, so I can make it all nice and creamy. So yeah, so that's what they'd be eating, and we'd have a few drinks, I'm sure. And yeah, they're my heroes, and that's what I would like. That's what I would like to have around my dinner table. Yeah,
they are excellent choices. It does sound as if you're kind of a bit like me, like fascinated with the dynamic between the 2 people in bands.
Yeah, well, that's interesting you point that out because that brings us back in an uncontrived way to Pete and Carl, isn't it?
Yeah.
So yeah, I hadn't even thought of that when I picked them. I mean, I'm fascinated by Lennon and McCartney. I always have been. Strummer and Jones, equally. And you can argue that Pete and Carl are in the same, it's lofty company to put them in, but they were a great partnership and are a great partnership. So they're not too far away from those guys in terms of their influence and the chemistry. They're very similar in a way. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, as a fan of the Beatles myself, I was always kind of John Lennon. I was always kind of family John Lennon camp up until a couple of years ago. Taking more of an interest in McCartney.
Yeah.
I think probably the film, that Get Back film that came out, that helped. Like watching and seeing what McCartney actually done, you're like, well, he did keep it together when the band was falling apart.
I've only ever seen the first episode of that. I've got it on DVD, so I'm going to be watching it in the next week because I can't wait to see it. And I couldn't get Disney Plus, but I'm looking forward to seeing that. I suppose, it's always been cooler to say John Lennon, isn't it? But I've always loved Wings. My brother was a big Wings fan and McCartney fan, so I've always leaned towards McCartney. So, I can't decide between them. It's like choosing your favourite kid, isn't it? I love them both, and I love McCartney's sort of whimsy. I love Lennon's hard edge, and I just love them both. And I got to give an honourable mention to George Harrison as well because he's not too shabby either.
No.
So that between them, so I'm looking forward to watching this Get Back. I saw the first episode at a pal's house, and it just looks fantastic. And
it's really good. You'll enjoy it.
So I got that on DVD to get stuck into now in these bleak January nights. So I'll give that a go.
Well, that's brilliant. You've been a fantastic guest. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. I'll post links to the book and your film.
Fabulous.
So people can check them out. But that's it for now. Thank you very much for coming on.
Great, thanks, Martin. It's been a real pleasure going down memory lane.
Brilliant, mate. Thank you. I hope you all enjoyed this episode of Time for Heroes podcast. If you would like to get in touch, the best way is on the Facebook page, Time for Heroes podcast, or on Instagram at Time for Heroes podcast, or Twitter at Time for Heroes P1, or drop me an email at timeforheroespod@gmail.com. You'll find Time for Heroes on all podcast platforms, including Spotify, Apple, Google and Amazon. Please leave a review where you can, share with others, and more importantly, enjoy.